I was always the target of Mr. Thompson's cruel jokes because of my accent. It was a constant torment. Every sarcastic and derogatory comment felt like a stab at my confidence. He would say things like, "Sarah, can anyone understand what you're saying? Or maybe you should take a speech class before trying public speaking." These words echoed in my mind, but I decided I wouldn't let it get me down. I remember one particularly difficult morning. I was organizing some reports when Mr. Thompson entered the room. "Sarah, come here right now," he shouted from his desk. I approached, trying to remain calm. "Yes, sir. Do you see this report? It's full of errors. Can't you do anything right?" I looked at the report and, to my relief, realized that there were no errors. He just wanted a reason to humiliate me in front of my colleagues. I took a deep breath and said, in a firm voice, "Mr. Thompson, I have reviewed this report 3 times. I would like to point out where the errors are so I can correct them." He seemed surprised by my direct answer, but said nothing more. He just snorted and waved me away. This attitude of his was constant and, every day, it became more difficult to keep his head up. But I knew I needed to do something. I decided the next company meeting would be my opportunity to prove myself. I started planning an impeccable presentation, something that would showcase my unquestionable skills and competence. I spent sleepless nights, working on the smallest details. I looked at every aspect of the company and thought of innovative solutions that could be implemented. My goal was to make everyone see that, despite my accent, I had a lot to contribute. During this process, I found support in James, a colleague who also faced prejudice, but for different reasons. We talked a lot about our experiences and he told me something that I will never forget. "Sarah, we both know what it's like to be underestimated. But we also know what we're capable of. Let's work together to prove ourselves." In these words, I found renewed strength. James and I started meeting after hours to work on the presentation. He helped me perfect every detail, while I encouraged him to develop and share his own innovative ideas. Our partnership has become a source of mutual inspiration. One day, during one of these meetings, James said, "You know, Sarah, I truly believe this presentation will change everything. Not just for you, but for all of us who deal with this kind of prejudice on a daily basis." "Me too, James. Let's do this together." In addition to James, I found unexpected support in Mrs. Clark, a senior executive at the company. She noticed my effort and dedication and decided to help me. During a conversation in her office, she gave me valuable advice. "Sarah, I know Mr. Thompson can be difficult, but you have incredible potential. Don't let him make you doubt yourself." "Thank you, Mrs. Clark. This means a lot to me. You'll do great in your presentation. And remember, you're not alone. I'm here for whatever you need." With the support of James and Mrs. Clark, I began to gain confidence. I revised my presentation numerous times, ensuring each point was clear and impactful. At the same time, James and I began encouraging other colleagues to talk about their own experiences of discrimination. We wanted to plant the seeds of a real change in the company's culture. Finally, the day of the meeting arrived. I was nervous, but determined. I walked into the conference room with my head held high, ready to face Mr. Thompson and prove myself. The tension was palpable, and all eyes were on me. "Good luck, Sarah," James whispered before the meeting began. "Thanks, James. Let's do this." And so, I began my presentation, with the determination to transform not only my life, but the culture of the entire company. I clearly remember the day I decided I could no longer bear Mr. Thompson's humiliations. Every time he made a sarcastic comment about my accent, I felt a lump in my throat, but I kept my head up. It was on one of those gloomy office afternoons that James approached me for the first time. "Hey, Sarah, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, with a worried expression on his face. I nodded, curious and a little suspicious. He took me to an empty meeting room and closed the door. "I see what you go through every day," he began. "I also face prejudice here, but for other reasons. and I know how exhausting that can be. I felt immediate relief upon hearing those words. Finally, someone understood what I was going through. We talked for hours, sharing our stories and frustrations. "We need to do something," James suggested. "We can't let him continue to treat people like this. And I'm sure you have the necessary talent to turn this game around." That's when the idea of preparing an impeccable presentation for the company's next meeting came up. James and I started getting together every night after work. He helped me review each slide, each chart, while I encouraged him to share his own innovative ideas. "Sarah, do you think this marketing approach will work?" he asked one night, while scribbling ideas on a notepad. "Yes, James. And I think we can go beyond that. We will suggest an implementation plan that shows short and long-term results. This will impress the board." We worked tirelessly, night after night. As the meeting date approached, I felt the need to seek more advice. That's when I met Mrs. Clark, a senior executive who had an impeccable reputation within the company. "Mrs. Clark, do you have a minute?" I asked shyly, approaching her in the hallway. "Of course, Sarah. What can I do for you?" she replied with a welcoming smile. I explained my situation and my plans for the presentation. She listened carefully and then said, "Sarah, you have incredible potential. I'll give you some tips on how to deal with Mr. Thompson and navigate this corporate environment. Remember, trust is key. And you have every right to be here and be respected." With Mrs. Clark's advice and James' constant support, I began to gain more confidence. We reviewed the presentation numerous times, ensuring each point was clear and impactful. In parallel, James and I began encouraging other colleagues to talk about their own experiences of discrimination. "We need to change this toxic culture," said James at one of the group's meetings. "And that starts with each one of us." Finally, the day of the meeting arrived. I walked into the conference room with my head held high, even though my heart was racing. The tension was palpable, and all eyes were on me. When I started the presentation, I felt a surge of confidence. "Good morning, everybody. Today, I'm going to present some innovative solutions that can transform our company," I started, capturing everyone's attention. As I spoke, I could see Mr. Thompson's expression gradually change from arrogance to surprise and finally to reluctant admiration. My presentation was a resounding success, receiving enthusiastic applause from everyone in the room. After the meeting, Mrs. Clark came to me and said, "I'm so proud of you, Sarah. This is just the beginning." James was also beaming. "You killed it, Sarah. I knew you could do it." The dynamics in the office began to change. Mr. Thompson was forced to reconsider his actions, and with Mrs. Clark's help, James and I began leading efforts to create a more inclusive and respectful environment. This experience not only strengthened my confidence, but also taught me the value of resilience and solidarity. We show that, together, we can face and overcome even the biggest obstacles. When work finally ended and the office emptied, Sarah and James remained at their desks, immersed in a sea of documents, slides and graphs. The connection they formed was instant and natural, based on a mutual understanding of the difficulties they faced. I remember one night when we were particularly exhausted but still determined to keep going. "Sarah, how about we try a different approach to this part of the presentation?" suggested James, pointing to a particularly dense slide. "You are sure?" "I think we can simplify this information without losing impact." I agreed, while adjusting the text on the computer. James was a constant source of creativity. Her fresh, innovative perspective was exactly what I needed to make my presentation not just good, but extraordinary. In return, I encouraged him to develop his own ideas, many of which were brilliant and deserved to be heard. "What if, instead of just presenting the numbers, we told a story?" proposed James, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "I like the idea. Stories have the power to capture people's attention in ways that numbers alone can't," I replied, already starting to outline a new structure for the presentation. These work sessions often extended late into the night. I remember one time when the clock was almost midnight, and we were still there, laughing and discussing ideas. "James, have you noticed how we're practically living here?" I joked, trying to ease the tension. "And truth. But you know what, Sarah? I'm enjoying this. We are doing something meaningful," he replied, with a genuine smile. Our work together was not limited to presentation. We also began exploring ways to transform the company culture. We discussed how to encourage our colleagues to share their own stories of discrimination, creating an environment where everyone feels heard and respected. "We need to create a safe space for people to speak," I said, while writing down ideas in a notepad. "I agree. And I think we can start with small informal meetings, perhaps over lunch," suggested James, always practical and down to earth. James' presence was a huge relief for me. He helped me see the future with optimism, even when things seemed bleak. One of the most memorable moments was when he brought up an idea that became the heart of our presentation. "Sarah, what if we showed how diversity can be a competitive advantage?" he said, with a spark in his eyes. "This is perfect. We can use examples of other companies that have prospered by adopting more inclusive policies," I replied, feeling a wave of enthusiasm invade me. Each work session brought us closer together, not just as colleagues, but as friends and allies. Our collaboration was proof that when determined people come together, they can overcome any obstacle. And while the journey was exhausting, it was also incredibly rewarding. "James, I don't know what I would do without you," I confessed one night, while we were putting away our materials. "And me without you, Sarah. We are in this together," he replied, with an encouraging smile. As the presentation date approached, our confidence grew. We knew we were preparing something special, something that could really make a difference. And most of all, we knew we were ready to face Mr. Thompson and prove ourselves. "We're ready, Sarah. Let's show them what we are capable of," said James, at the end of one of these sessions. "Yes, we are ready," I agreed, feeling an unshakable determination growing within me. Those nights of hard work and collaboration were, without a doubt, one of the most transformative periods of my life. And, with James by my side, I was more than prepared for the challenge that lay ahead. During this process, I met Mrs. Clark, a senior executive who soon became an essential figure in my journey. It was on one of those days when I was buried in notes and slides that she appeared in my office for the first time. "You're Sarah, right?" she asked, with a welcoming smile. "Yes, it's me. How can I help you?" I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. Mrs. Clark entered the room and closed the door behind her. "I've heard about your work and what you're trying to do. I think you have enormous potential, and I'd like to offer my help." I was surprised and a little skeptical. "Why would you do that?" "You know Mr. Thompson doesn't really approve of my ideas." She laughed softly. "Mr. Thompson has a very limited vision. I, on the other hand, believe that diversity is the driving force of innovation. And, honestly, I'm tired of seeing talent being wasted because of silly prejudices. So what do you say?" I accepted her help without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Clark became an invaluable mentor. She taught me not only about improving my presentation, but also about dealing with internal company politics and navigating an often hostile corporate environment. "Sarah, the secret is to never let them see you falter," she told me in one of our sessions. "You have to be firm, even when you're scared to death inside." Once, as we were reviewing my presentation script, she paused and looked straight into my eyes. "Sarah, you know this isn't just about a presentation, right? It's about changing the culture of this company. Are you ready for this responsibility?" I took a deep breath. "Yes, I am. I just need the chance to show what I can do." Mrs. Clark smiled. "And you will. I guarantee it." She also gave me practical advice on how to deal with Mr. Thompson. Don't confront him directly. Use emotional intelligence to your advantage. Show him the results, and he will have no choice but to recognize your value. During our conversations, Mrs. Clark shared some of her own experiences of struggling and overcoming in the corporate world. "I've been underestimated too, Sarah. Many times. But I've learned to use that to my advantage. Whenever someone doubted me, I saw it as an opportunity to prove them wrong. With each session, I felt more confident and prepared." Mrs. Clark not only guided me through the content of the presentation, but also strengthened my self-esteem and resilience. "Remember, Sarah, you are not alone. James, I and many others are by your side. And most importantly, you have yourself. Trust in your talent." One afternoon, after a long meeting, she took me aside. "Sarah, I hear Mr. Thompson is trying to sabotage your presentation. He's afraid you'll outshine him." I sighed. "It's no surprise to me. He's always done that." Mrs. Clark placed her hand on my shoulder. "We can't let that happen. We'll be prepared for anything. And if he tries something, I'll be there to support you." With this advice and Mrs. Clark's unwavering support, my confidence grew exponentially. She provided me not only with the technical guidance, but also with the emotional strength needed to face the biggest challenge of my career. "You'll make it, Sarah. And when you do, you'll be an example to all of us about how competence and determination can overcome any obstacle." And so, with Mrs. Clark's support, I prepared for presentation day with new energy and determination. She had planted the seed of confidence in me, and I was ready to let that seed blossom. The feeling of having James and Mrs. Clark by my side was a turning point. With their support, I began to feel a confidence that had long felt distant. James, with his insight and creativity, helped polish every detail of my presentation. Mrs. Clark, with her experience and wisdom, provided valuable advice on how to deal with Mr. Thompson and navigate the corporate environment. It was as if, together, we formed an unbeatable front against the company's toxic culture. "Sarah, you're doing great," James said to me one night as we reviewed the slides once again. "I know it's hard, but you have everything you need to do this." "Thank you, James," I replied, feeling gratitude overflowing. "I don't know what I would do without you and Mrs. Clark." Mrs. Clark also spared no effort to make sure I was prepared. "Sarah, remember that clarity is key. Make every point as clear as daylight. And never underestimate the power of your own voice." With this advice in mind, I revisited the presentation countless times, tweaking and refining every slide, every word. I wanted to ensure my message was clear and impactful. At the same time, James and I began to plant seeds of change within the company. We spoke to other colleagues, encouraging them to talk about their own experiences of discrimination and to support each other. "We need to build a support network," James suggested during one of our brainstorming sessions. "If everyone comes together, it will be harder for people like Mr. Thompson to continue to perpetuate this toxic environment." I agreed enthusiastically. "Yes, we need to be the change we want to see here. And that starts with small actions, like supporting each other and talking openly about what we face." These conversations started to make a difference. We noticed that more colleagues were willing to share their stories and come together in search of a more inclusive environment. Little by little, the atmosphere in the office began to change. There was a growing sense of solidarity and mutual support. But, even with all this progress, I knew that the big test was still to come, the presentation. I was determined to demonstrate my skills and prove that, despite Mr. Thompson's prejudices, I was a competent and dedicated professional. "You're ready, Sarah," Mrs. Clark told me the day before the meeting. His eyes sparkled with a mixture of pride and encouragement. "Remember that you are stronger than you think. And no matter what happens, you have already made a significant difference here." Those words were all I needed to hear. I walked into the conference room on the day of the meeting with my head held high, feeling the weight of expectations but also the strength of James and Mrs. Clark's support. The tension was palpable, but I was ready. "Good morning, everyone," I began, feeling an initial nervousness that quickly dissipated as I progressed through the presentation. Every slide, every point, was a testament to my hard work and dedication. As he spoke, he could see Mr. Thompson's expression change from arrogance to surprise and finally to reluctant admiration. The presentation was a resounding success. I received enthusiastic applause and praise from several colleagues. Most importantly, I felt like I had achieved something significant. Not only had I proven myself, but I had also taken an important step toward transforming the company culture. James, next to me, smiled and said, "You did it, Sarah. And you did it amazingly." Mrs. Clark also expressed her pride. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah. This is just the beginning of something big." With the support of James and Mrs. Clark, I continued to fight for a more fair and inclusive workplace. And although the battle was far from over, I knew that together we were a force to be reckoned with. The day of the meeting arrived. I was nervous but determined. I felt a mix of anxiety and excitement as I walked through the company's corridors, with my notebook in hand and the presentation carefully prepared in my mind. Every step I took was a reminder of the arduous path that brought me here, the derogatory comments, the disdainful looks, and the muffled laughter behind my back. But at that moment, I was ready to face it all. As I entered the conference room, I could feel the tension in the air. All eyes were on me, including Mr. Thompson's, whose cold gaze seemed to try to intimidate me. I took a deep breath, lifted my head and walked to the center of the room. James gave me an encouraging look from across the table, and Mrs. Clark nodded discreetly, signaling her support. It gave me the extra strength I needed. "Good morning, everyone," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Today, I'd like to share some ideas that I believe could bring great benefits to our company." I began the presentation confidently, highlighting the key points and innovative solutions that James and I had developed. With each slide, I felt the room more attentive. The initial tension gave way to genuine curiosity. It was as if I had finally managed to capture everyone's attention in a way I never had before. "As you can see," I continued, pointing to the graph on the screen, "these changes will not only increase efficiency, but also reduce operating costs by 15% over the next 6 months. Mr. Thompson, who initially maintained an arrogant posture, began to shift in his seat. I could see the surprise on his face, and it only encouraged me more. "Sarah, could you explain further how you intend to implement these changes?" asked one of the directors, visibly impressed. "Of course," I replied, opening one of the detailed slides. We mapped the entire current process and identified critical points where we can optimize resources. The first phase involves restructuring teams to make better use of individual skills. As I explained, I noticed that the looks of disbelief were turning into expressions of recognition and admiration. Even Mr. Thompson, who never gave me credit, began to pay genuine attention. "That's a pretty innovative approach," commented Mrs. Clark, smiling. "I'm particularly impressed with the risk analysis you and James did." "Thank you, Mrs. Clark," I replied, feeling a warmth of gratitude. "It was a team effort, and I believe everyone will see the benefits quickly." At the end of the presentation, the room exploded in applause. I was panting, not just from the tension, but from the relief of having done it. Mr. Thompson, with an expression that mixed surprise and a certain reluctance, stood up. "Sarah," he began, visibly disconcerted. "I must admit that I underestimated you. Your presentation was exceptional, and I believe everyone here agrees that we need to implement your ideas immediately." That moment was a watershed moment. Not just for me, but for all my colleagues who, like James, faced prejudice on a daily basis. The dynamics in the office began to change quickly. With Mrs. Clark's support and James' collaboration, we began a series of initiatives to promote a more inclusive and respectful environment. "Sarah," said James, as we left the conference room, "you were amazing." "We did it." "Yes, we did it," I replied, smiling. "But this is just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do." And so, with the victory of the presentation, we began a new era in the company. An era of respect, inclusion and recognition of the value of each individual, regardless of their origins or accents. Mr. Thompson, on the other hand, had to deal with the consequences of his unethical attitudes and practices. And I was finally able to show that resilience and solidarity can overcome even the most difficult obstacles. When it was my turn to present, I felt my heart beat faster, but I refused to let my nervousness get the better of me. I took a deep breath, raised my head and began my presentation. From the first slide, I captured the attention of everyone in the room. The lights in the conference room were dim, highlighting the screen where my charts and key points shined clearly. Good morning, everyone. Today, I would like to share some innovative strategies that can take our company to a new level of efficiency and success. I began, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tension I felt. I looked directly at Mr. Thompson, who was looking at me with his usual critical gaze. As I went along, I detailed each of my proposals precisely. I showed how we could optimize our internal processes, reduce costs, and improve customer satisfaction. Each point was backed by solid data that James and I had collected and carefully analyzed over weeks of hard work. And here, we can see a projected 20% increase in productivity if we implement these changes, he said, pointing to a graph that showed a clear growth trend. Not only will this benefit the company financially, but it will also create a more harmonious and efficient work environment for all of us. As I spoke, I subtly noticed my colleagues' expressions change. At first, many seemed skeptical, perhaps even distracted, but I soon noticed that they were increasingly interested and engaged. It was as if I had managed to break through an invisible barrier that had existed for so long. Mrs. Clark, sitting in the front row, looked at me with an encouraging smile. This gave me an extra dose of confidence. Beside her, James nodded discreetly, as if to say, "You're doing well, keep going." "Sarah, could you explain further how you intend to implement these new processes without disrupting the current operation?" asked one of the directors, clearly impressed but seeking more details. "Of course," I replied promptly. "We have a phased transition plan, which minimizes any disruption. In the first phase, we will focus on areas of lower impact, allowing employees to adapt gradually. In the second phase, we will scale the changes to more critical sectors, always with support and training continuous." At that moment I looked at Mr. Thompson again. To my surprise, he no longer had that arrogant expression he always had. Instead, he seemed to actually be considering what I was saying. "Sarah, these proposals are really impressive," he said, finally breaking the silence. "But do you think the team will be ready for these changes? We have people here who have been in the same role for years." I knew this was an attempt to destabilize me, but I was prepared. "Mr. Thompson, I believe that with proper training and clear communication, our team will not only be ready for, but embrace, these changes. And as we mentioned previously, James and I have already begun to plant these seeds of change by encouraging our colleagues to express themselves and become more actively involved." James intervened at this point, reinforcing my position. "Exactly. We already have positive feedback from several teams who are eager for improvements. Sarah's ideas are innovative and practical, and bring new life to our company." The tension in the room decreased significantly. The presentation continued to flow smoothly and engagingly. Each slide I showed seemed to further strengthen my position. When I finished, there was a moment of silence that seemed to last an eternity. Then, suddenly, the room was filled with enthusiastic applause. Mrs. Clark was the first to get up, followed by James and, surprisingly, even Mr. Thompson. "Excellent work, Sarah," he said, reluctantly, but with a sincerity I'd never seen before. "You have truly shown a deep understanding of the challenges and opportunities we face." I smiled, feeling a rush of relief and pride. I knew this was just the beginning, but I had already taken a huge step towards a fairer and more respectful work environment. As I spoke, I could feel the tension in the conference room begin to dissipate. All eyes were fixed on me, and for the first time, it wasn't because of my accent, but because of the content I was presenting. With each slide that passed, I saw the faces of colleagues who had previously looked at me with disdain now displaying expressions of genuine interest. I was in the middle of explaining a new market strategy when I looked at Mr. Thompson. He, who always maintained an arrogant posture and a critical look, now had an expression of surprise. It was clear that he didn't expect me, the girl with the funny accent, to be able to bring such well-structured and innovative ideas. Continuing, I said, trying to stay calm as my heart pounded. This strategy will not only increase our market reach, but also reduce operating costs by around 15% in the first 6 months. Mr. Thompson adjusted his posture in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. He scratched his throat and, for the first time, interrupted me in a way that didn't seem condescending. "Sarah, these numbers are impressive," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can you explain how you came to these conclusions?" "Of course, Mr. Thompson," I replied, maintaining my composure. "I performed a detailed analysis of market data from recent years and identified consumption patterns that were being overlooked. Additionally, I worked with the finance team to ensure our projections were realistic and achievable." As I spoke, I saw Mrs. Clark, sitting in the back of the room, nodding her head in approval. James, next to me, gave me a small, encouraging smile. Their support was essential for me to maintain my confidence. The presentation continued without further interruptions. Every point, every graph, every solution presented was met with murmurs of approval and looks of admiration. When I finally finished, a heavy silence hung in the air for a few seconds, followed by thunderous applause. "Excellent work, Sarah," exclaimed Mrs. Clark, standing up. "Your ideas are exactly what this company needs to move forward. I am very impressed." Mr. Thompson, visibly disconcerted, slowly stood up. "I have to agree," he said, in a voice that tried to hide his reluctance. "It was an exceptional presentation. And I want to apologize if at any point I underestimated your capabilities. You have proven that you are a valuable employee for this company." Those words, even if said with difficulty, meant a lot. Not just for me, but for all my colleagues who, like me, faced some type of prejudice. I looked at James, who gave me a nod, and then at Mrs. Clark, who was beaming. After the meeting, many colleagues came to congratulate me. "Sarah, you were amazing," said Amanda, an analyst in the marketing department. "You've given us hope that things can really change around here." "Thank you, Amanda," I replied, sincerely. "But this victory belongs to all of us. Together, we can transform this company into a better place to work." Later, as James and I were packing our materials, he commented, "You made history today, Sarah. And I'm sure this is just the first of many achievements." I smiled at him, feeling a mixture of relief and satisfaction. "I couldn't have done it without you and Mrs. Clark. We're a team, and we still have a lot of work to do." And so, on that day, it was not just my voice that was heard, but that of all those who, like me, were underestimated and marginalized. The presentation was a milestone, but also a starting point for a new era in the company, where respect and inclusion would be the new guidelines. After my presentation, I realized that something had changed in the work environment. The performance that James and I had so carefully prepared not only impressed the board, but also forced Mr. Thompson to reconsider his actions. He, who had always despised me because of my accent, was now in front of all his colleagues, having no choice but to publicly recognize my talent and competence. That morning, right after the meeting, Thompson called me into his office. He looked uncomfortable, something I had never seen before. "Sarah," he began, with a hesitation in his voice that was new to me, I'd like to congratulate you on the performance. It was exceptional." I remained calm, even though inside I was boiling with emotions. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," I replied, trying not to let on how much those words meant to me. It was a team effort. James and Mrs. Clark were instrumental. Thompson nodded, visibly disconcerted. "I know I may have made some mistakes in the past," he admitted, looking at the floor. "I'll try to be more fair from now on." When I left the office, I felt a mixture of relief and caution. Could it be possible that Thompson really changed? I wasn't sure, but I knew this attitude was an important step. Upon entering the common area, I was greeted with smiles and greetings from colleagues. James approached, with that usual shy smile. "You were amazing, Sarah," he said, patting my shoulder. "If anyone still had doubts about your talent, I think you eliminated them all." I smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. Thank you, James. I couldn't have done it without your help. Over the next few days, I noticed a gradual change in the office. As my presentation gained attention, other colleagues began to feel more encouraged to talk about their own experiences of discrimination. James and I led this initiative, organizing small meetings to discuss how we could create a more inclusive and respectful work environment. Mrs. Clark also played a key role in this process. She called me into her office several times to discuss strategies and offer me advice. "Sarah, you're doing wonderfully," she said on one such occasion. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but you've already planted the seeds. Keep it up." I took her advice and started to notice that the dynamic in the office was really changing. Thompson, while still a bit resistant, seemed to be making a genuine effort to be more fair. He even publicly praised James' work in a meeting, something I would never have expected to see. However, the real turnaround happened shortly afterwards. An internal investigation, prompted by some anonymous complaints, revealed that Mr. Thompson was involved in unethical practices that harmed the company. When I heard about this, I was shocked, but I also saw an opportunity to finally bring justice to the workplace. James and I worked together to gather evidence and present our findings to the board. It was a tense process, but in the end, the truth prevailed. Mr. Thompson was fired and sued, and the company began implementing strict measures to prevent any type of unethical behavior in the future. With Thompson's departure, I was promoted to a leadership position. This gave me the opportunity to implement my ideas and transform the company culture for the better. I worked tirelessly to ensure that all employees felt valued and respected, regardless of their backgrounds or personal characteristics. The victory was complete. Not only did I overcome prejudice, but I also helped create a more fair and inclusive work environment. Looking back, I realized that resilience and solidarity really can overcome even the most difficult obstacles. And most importantly, I learned that we should never underestimate the power of our voices and actions when united for a just cause. Finally, the real turning point came shortly after that life-changing performance. One day, while James and I were in the cafeteria, he approached us with a worried expression. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "Of course, James. What happened?" I asked, feeling butterflies in my stomach. "I discovered something very serious about Mr. Thompson. He is involved in unethical practices that are harming the company," James revealed, lowering his voice. My heart accelerated. We knew Thompson was a terrible boss, but this was beyond what any of us imagined. We decided we needed to act, but cautiously. That night we stayed late in the office, gathering evidence. Emails, documents, everything we could find that proved Thompson's illicit activities. It was exhausting work, but we knew it was necessary. As we worked, James expressed his gratitude. "Sarah, I never imagined we would be doing this. You are an inspiration for me." "And you to me, James." "We're in this together," I replied, with an encouraging smile. With the evidence in hand, we knew we needed Mrs. Clark's support. The next day, we asked for an urgent meeting with her. "Mrs. Clark, we have something very serious to share," I began, while James nodded beside me. "What's so urgent, Sarah?" she asked, intrigued. We hand over the documents we collected and explain everything we discovered. Mrs. Clark read carefully, her expression changing from curiosity to shock and finally determination. "This is unacceptable. I will take this to the company board immediately," Mrs. Clark declared firmly. The following days were a roller coaster of emotions. An internal investigation was launched, and Mr. Thompson was called to provide clarification. Meanwhile, James and I continued to carry out our duties, but the tension in the air was palpable. Then finally the verdict was announced. Mr. Thompson was fired and sued for his unethical practices. The news quickly spread throughout the company, and the environment, which had previously been one of fear and distrust, began to change. Shortly thereafter, I was called to a meeting with Mrs. Clark and other board members. My heart was pounding as I walked into the room, not knowing what to expect. "Sarah, we want to thank you for your courage and integrity. "Not only did you prove your worth, but you also helped save our company from a big problem," said one of the directors. "And so, we would like to promote you to a leadership position. We believe you have the vision and ability to transform our corporate culture for the better," added Mrs. Clark, with an encouraging smile. I couldn't hold back the tears of joy and relief. I thanked everyone for their trust and promised to do my best. When I left the room, James was waiting for me outside. "And then?" he asked, anxiously. "I was promoted," I replied, with a radiant smile. James hugged me, and in that moment I knew our journey was just beginning. With the new position, I began implementing the ideas we discussed and worked hard to create a more inclusive and respectful environment. The challenges were not over, but the victory was complete. We were able to not only overcome prejudice, but also bring justice to a toxic work environment. I proved that resilience and solidarity can overcome even the most difficult obstacles. And, most of all, I learned that we are never alone when we have the courage to fight for what is right.